Welcome. Prior to giving one of his last readings at Harvard in the mid-1950s, Wallace Stevens observed, "I have always disliked the idea of records. And yet on the one occasion that I visited the Woodberry Poetry Room in the New Library at Cambridge, there were half dozen people sitting around with tubes in their ears, taking it all in the most natural way in the world." In Stevens' honor tonight, we're going to unstop the ears of our singular, solitary listening and release those sounds again into the open air, or at least into the inner air of the library. And who better to accompany that liberation than Professor Helen Vendler, whose career has not been that of a scholar of one candle, spanning as it has the great gamut of Shakespeare, Dickinson, Herbert, Hopkins, Yeats, Graham, and Ashbery, to name a few. And yet her mind has always returned with renewed and accumulated insight to the works of the Hartford bard. And we are grateful that she has agreed to share her perceptions this evening. Please welcome Helen Vendler.
The people who are standing, there are four empty seats right here. Come on up and claim the 4 empty seats, somebody. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here, and as always, to talk about Stevens. Once when somebody asked me to give a series of lectures, sorry, is this okay? Go down. When someone asked me to give a series of lectures, and I said I didn't have any lectures, I had just finished a book, I had nothing in the drawer, I had nothing in files. And then he said, well, what about Wallace Stevens? And I said, oh, I can always say more about Stevens. That's been my doom, so to speak. I keep coming back and coming back, as Stevens said, to the real, and for me, he's part of the real. This is kind of a history, as you know from the ad, of my own relations with Stevens in brief. The poetry room, when I was here as a graduate student, was closed to women because it was in Lamont, which was the men's undergraduate library. The women had their own undergraduate library down at Radcliffe, so I could not enter the poetry room. I'm just crazy, of course. But in the summertime, because the summer school was co-ed, miraculously Lamont became co-ed too. So I went in there with a friend. I was 23, I think. And I had my first book I ever bought was Oscar Williams' little anthology of modern poetry. And so I've been reading in that for some years, but every time I came to Stevens, I would hit something that I didn't like about him. And I didn't even bother to inquire why I didn't like it, but I would look down and I would think, I don't see how a peignoir can have complacencies. And then I turn the page. I don't see why anyone would want to look at a blackbird 13 ways. I mean, it was just completely prejudice on my part because they didn't look like the poems I knew. And so the friend I was with wanted to hear Wallace Stevens. At that time, there wasn't a commercial record of Stevens. So heaving a sigh, I put on my headphones too and heard this beautiful voice coming out and reading the poem called To the One of Fictive Music. And I immediately thought, oh, okay, now I've got it. But I didn't know why I would get that and not get the other things. And I was thinking about it later and realized that I was brought up a Roman Catholic with a lot of liturgy and a lot of hymns and all of that. And I had also read a great deal in earlier poetry, not modernist poetry. And so I knew what a poem should sound like. And it should either sound like the Te Deum, or it should sound like my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. And then I'd know it was a poem. And Stevens didn't sound like that. He didn't declare something up front. He didn't declare an emotional situation up front. Instead, he had his complacencies of the peignoir. And of course, when I look back now and see To the One of Fictive Music, it is a hymn. It is addressed to the Muse, who turns out to be a trinity, just like the Christian Trinity. She's a sister and a mother and a love, so that she occupies the sibling relationship, the maternal relationship, and the paramour relationship. And there are 3 of her, so she fulfills all roles, if it's just the way Father, Son, and Holy Spirit will. So everything was innately familiar to me of the outlines of the theology of the muse, you might say, and I could slide right into it without any trouble. Let me play the poem for you to the One of Fictive music. Also, it was very logical, yet, or, the stanzas were linked by clear transitions, which he doesn't always do.
One of Fictive music. Sister and mother and diviner love, and of the sisterhood of the living dead, most near, most clear, and of the clearest bloom, and of the fragrant mothers, the most dear and queen, and of diviner love, the day, and flame, and summer, and sweet fire. No thread of cloudy silver sprinkles in your gown its venom of renown, and on your head no crown is simpler than the simple hair. Now, of the music summoned by the birth that separates us from the wind and sea, yet leaves us in them until earth becomes, by being so much of the things we are, gross effigy and simulacrum. None gives motion to perfection more serene than yours, out of our imperfections wrought, most rare, or ever of more kindred air, in the laborious weaving that you wear. For so retentive of themselves are men, that music is intensest, which proclaims the near, the clear, and vaunts the clearest bloom, and of all vigils musing the obscure, that apprehends the most, which sees and names as in your name an image that is sure, among the arid spices of the sun, O bough and bush and scented vine, in whom we give ourselves our likest issuance, yet not too like, yet not so like to be too near, too clear, saving a little to endow our feigning with the strange unlike, whence springs the difference that heavenly pity brings. For this, musician, in your girdle fixed, bear other perfumes. On your pale head wear a band entwining, set with fatal stones. Unreal, give back to us what once you gave. The imagination that we spurned and crave.
You can see that that is a repudiation of one theology in favor of another. Since I was perfectly aware of how to do that, I saw that the turn at the end, where after you've done the hymn-like, ode-like stanzas, you then came back to the imagination, which would need a new form. There was the imagination that we spurned, which was the one that was, what should you say, the one he grew up with. And then there's a new imagination which he craves. And so the old imagination will be preserved into the new imagination because it will be like but not too like. And there has to be an unreal. And so that the procession of the poem is towards that adopting of a new theology of the muse, if you wish. And it's made easy for us in part because there are rhymes which tie it together. I was used to rhymes. I could understand if a poem had rhymes, it was a poem. I really had very primitive ideas of poetry. I had very strong emotions with respect to it, but I hadn't thought about it in any theoretical way. And by adorning this goddess, the muse, with a crown, and then sort of taking the crown, no crown is simpler than the simple hair, by leaving her in her natural state, but by the end, imagining that she needs a new real crown, but it will be set with fatal stones, not the stones of everlasting life, the jewels in your crown in heaven, etc., but rather the jewels that go with mortality. And she is allowed to become a goddess, but a goddess of the mortal world rather than a goddess of an eternal world. The titles he gives her, O bough and bush and scented, O bough and bush and scented vine, those are drawn, I think, from the Litany of the Virgin Mary, in which a succession of titles are predicated of Mary, House of Gold, Tower of Ivory, metaphorical things like bough and bush and scented vine. So that he's taking over part of a liturgical significance from Christianity, part of an iconic, an image, such as the Virgin Mary, but she's tinged with other goddesses and the figures of the muses, of course, the 9 muses who are on Parnassus with Apollo. What I liked about it then was that it was not abrupt. I was used to lyric having the prime, what shall I say, characteristic of music, of sliding from one stanza to the next, the way Keats's odes slide from one stanza to the next, and you're not brought up short by anything. And although there are poets before Stevens who bring you up short, I didn't like those either. I didn't like Browning. I couldn't bear a poem that started with grrr. A poem, the Soliloquy in a Spanish cloister, in case you don't know, it's a monk who begins by growling. And I just didn't know what to do with a poem like that. But the ones I could not understand of Stevens were, of course, skipped over by me until I began to read him in earnest, which was the following year. And at the time I was writing a dissertation on Yeats, and when the dissertation was published, one acute reviewer said, in the footnotes of this book on Yeats, there is a crypto book on Wallace Stevens. That was more or less true. He was on my mind in all circumstances and with all respects, and I learned a great deal from reading him. But it was more that I always knew, once I had become familiar with his voice, I thought of all the poems as mysterious packages that had something for me inside. And if I didn't know what it was, I had to be patient and try to keep opening the package and finding the mysterious keyhole or something that would finally make the whole package fan itself out and open itself out for you. And then, of course, it's a wonderful feeling when, as he says in another poem, we must endure our thoughts all night. He's in a snowstorm and he can't see anything. We must endure our thoughts all night until the bright obvious stands forth in the cold, in the morning when you can see. And so it was the bright obvious that kept, and I was thinking, why didn't I see that before? But it's because you have to get used to him, as you do have to get used to all poets. But one of the things that attracted me here, too, was that he was operating in a world of value that I knew, that is to say, the world of superlatives, most near, most clear, the clearest bloom, diviner, divinest. It keeps coming back to the superlatives which we associate, of course, with God. And the superlative is exclusively occupied by God in terms of Christian theology. So he takes all the superlatives, it's like a heap of them, and applies them over crosswise, takes them out of the Christian theology and applies them to the muse, to this goddess. So I understood the use of superlatives too. It's funny how what you bring to poetry in your early stages with it depends a lot on what you can take in and then what is opaque to you. Now this was perfectly transparent to me. I've been reading things like this all my life. So that encouraged me to go on with Stevens. At the same time in early Stevens, when I read Harmonium, from which to the One of Fictive music comes. I also read these other weird poems that I couldn't understand. I sometimes understood the theme without understanding why anyone would want to write about it this way. That was the case with Bantams in Pine Woods, which I'll let you hear. It's about roosters. Why would anyone, etc.
Bantams in Pine Woods. Chieftain, if you can, and as can, in caftan of tan with henna hackles, halt. Damned universal cock, as if the sun was blackamoor to bear your blazing tail. Fat, 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 fat. I am the personal. Your world is you. I am my world. You 10-foot poet among inchlings, fat. Begone. An inchling bristles in these pines, bristles and points their Appalachian tangs, and fears not, portly as can, nor is whose.
I was at a loss. I was totally at a loss. It sounded sort of like Edward Lear, the Owl and the Pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea green boat, but I knew that it wasn't. And so I was frustrated that someone should use, you might say, the means of nonsense for the ends of sense. And of course, now I can hardly believe that I didn't understand it at the time. It seems so transparent now. Nonetheless, what you have is this bizarre scene in Appalachia, and the scene is a yard that has little bantam roosters in it, and into the yard full of little bantam roosters, it's bantams in pine woods, so there's scruffy sort of pine woods around, in walks this great big rooster. And what the little rooster who speaks to him does is very strange, because he acts as, first of all, as a policeman, and then as a kind of cleric. First he says, halt, just what a policeman would say. And then later he says, begone, which is exactly what an exorcist or something would say. So this little feisty creature takes on immense amounts of authority vis-a-vis this great big rooster. He has to distinguish between the little bantam roosters around himself and others, and this great big rooster, who looks in some ways the same, has the same kind of coloring and feathers and general shape as the bantam roosters, but he is so immense that the little rooster has to think up some way of identifying him. And so that I was very puzzled by those chieftain, if you can, of as can, in caftan of tan with henna hackles, halt. Why this parade of names, weird names? And I wasn't really sure what he was talking about until I saw in Rio de Janeiro, in the museum there, one of the feather capes that the South American Indians wore, immense. The chieftains would wear these wonderful cloaks where thousands, literally, I think, of feathers were attached by some tiny stitches to the material underneath. So when you put on the cloak of feathers, you were a dazzling sight. I mean, you were a bird clothed more gorgeously, because these are tropical birds, of course, so that the colors are very alive. And he thinks you look like an Aztec chief in your feather cape. I think that's what is behind chieftain, if you can, but you can't, ha-ha, because I am here. Chieftain, if you can, of Azcan, in caftan. That makes him it's Orientalism, of course. Makes him a prince, a chieftain of tan, naturally, with henna hackles, halt. You can see that this is strung on a string of sound, of the A-N sound, A-I-N and chieftain, but going on, linking all the beginnings with the A-N sound, and then it goes into an H sound of tan with henna hackles, halt. This is absurd too. Alliteration is all very well, and so is assonance, but when you do it up to the point of preposterousness, you wonder why it's there, or at least I did when I was young. And what took me a while to understand in this poem was how the universal cock related to the bantam rooster. And because universal is put over against personal, and yet the cock is called a 10-foot poet among inchlings. And so he too is a poet, just like the inchling poet who was talking to him. But why is he universal? And it seems to me it has something to do with epic and Miltonic affluence, so that he is grand. And he's a universal poet because he's an epic writer, and epic tells the story of a whole culture. And this little bantam rooster is standing up for lyric and saying, I am the personal, and defining the personal aesthetically as something that is small by comparison to the epic rooster there, but nonetheless charming and lively, so that he banishes the rooster by calling it sort of a cross between a giant, an ogre, and a gross fat person. Fat, 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 he says, spitting it out as you heard on the recording. Before I'd heard him read it, I thought it would be fat, 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 fat. And I was very surprised the first time I heard fat, 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 fat. But it's sort of spitting it out as he says it on the record. Then came the center of the poem when we see that the cock is that which turns outwards and dominates the whole outside world, as if the sun were blackamoor to bear your blazing tail. And the little bantam rooster turns inward, as lyric does, and when he says, your world is you, the epic poet embraces his world and brings it home. But I am my world, which means that the interior chamber of lyric constitutes an entire world for the lyric poet. He doesn't have to go out to the sun. I mean, he has quite enough to do looking into his own soul. The end of the poem, which is the threat made by the little tiny bold bantam to the great big poet, says, I'm not afraid of you. Calls him portly, another word for fat. They used to have a line in men's clothes called portly, which is very awful to me. And the word that the little bantam uses for himself, the verb he ascribes to himself, is bristles. And that verb is in the first poem in Harmonium, where the firecat bristles in the way when the bucks went clattering over Oklahoma. Well, bristle is important for Stevens in this book because it's as though he's a porcupine and can put out quills and suddenly bristle. And it's a nice trick. Little bantam roosters, I think, don't in logic bristle, but it's a transferred metaphor. An inchling, he says it twice, bristles in these pines, bristles, and points their Appalachian tangs. The tang is the top of the pine tree. The tang is the part of the knife that fits into the handle. And so the pointed end of the pine trees are not as pointed as they might be until the little bantam rooster bestows some pointedness on them. So he's doing that, and fears not, he says, sneering, portly as can, nor his who's. Who is a word that Stevens uses over and over, not always successfully. Maybe it isn't successful here. But it stands for syllables that haven't yet been made into commendable articulation. Nature says who all the time. The ocean says who and rises and says who and falls. And then he says, life's nonsense pierces us with strange relation. How can I make words out of this who up and who down? And so he puts it in when there isn't an articulable thought. This big rooster is sort of too big to operate in this world. The world belongs to the little bristling bantam. But the intrusion of the epic into the lyric world, saying, sort of flexing its muscles and saying, look at me, and I'm a noble, and I have a great big feather cloak, and you are nobody. This is, you might say, a democratic revolt against monarchy. This is less clearly associated with tradition, of course, than to the one of fictive music. It doesn't rhyme. It does have more or less 4 beats, but not always. 5-beat lines are there too, whereas to the One of Fictive music is all 5-beat lines and has the lull of the regular rhythm coming back that I was used to too in poetry. And so this was a puzzle that it was unlike the incantation of To the One of Fictive music. This one was, as I said, a set of commands and an exorcism, get out of my world. And the poet was clearly taking the bantam rooster as his own persona. I am the personal, I am my world, with those blank declarative statements in the middle of the poem. And if he wanted to say that, you wonder, why did he need roosters to say it? I mean, this was the bafflement to me of early Stevens, because it wasn't a lark, and it wasn't a nightingale, and it wasn't a robin, and it wasn't a swallow. I was used to all those. Even the blue jay that he uses in 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird would have been more congenial to me as at least something that flies in the air, whereas bantam roosters scratch around a hen yard. And so they had none of the elevation associated with them that the birds of British poetry had, or even the birds of American poetry, like Whitman's hermit thrush, who warbles a beautiful song just the way the nightingale does. But these bristling little creatures are not making beautiful songs. So they were completely out of my scope of iconic recognition. They wouldn't be now, but it gives you an appreciation for the courage of the modernist poets when they departed so far from the inherited British tradition of lyric that somebody soaked in lyric in that very tradition didn't recognize them as poems. I mean, it's really bold that to dare to put out Bantams in pine woods and say, this is my idea of what lyric should be, this is my bird. Don't expect any larks and nightingales here. Only grackles, as Stevens later says. Then many years pass, and I spend some of them writing about Stevens. His long poems have been criticized as ponderous and elephantine by Randall Jarrell, whose critical work I loved. And so I was very upset that Randall Jarrell, whose taste I respected and whose energy of critical delight I loved, would be saying Stevens was ponderous and elephantine, as though he was saying, you're a great big rooster and I like little bantams. So I decided that somebody should say what was good about the long poems, and that's what turned into my second book, the book that was hovering in the footnotes there of the first book. And it was a great pleasure to me to write about those long poems because they hadn't really been written about much. People would dismiss them as not the interesting Stevens. The interesting Stevens was supposed to be the person who wrote 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird and Bantams in Pine Woods, because these shook up the tradition. Whereas the long poems, the first Browning-esque one, The Comedian is the Let Us See, is perhaps the closest to tradition, but the other ones were just long meditations that would not be amiss in a book of romantic poetry if you read the Auroras of Autumn. I mean, the Northern Lights were written about by Christopher Cranch and Emily Dickinson and Emerson. It was a stock topic, the Northern Lights, rare as they are in these areas. But to write about them again, and to write about them in a beautiful and lyric title like the Auroras of Autumn, was to many critics' minds backslide back into the tradition after you had done all these bold and interesting things with blackbirds. So I worked my way through the long poems and became very fond of them. Wasn't able to deal with the last one, really, although theoretically there was a chapter devoted to it, An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. It was just too big and too much the work of an old man at the time for me, a young woman, to really understand emotionally. That's always a problem, but it occurred to me especially in that. And I'm sorry now about the chapter I wrote about An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. Doesn't do justice to the poem, but there it is. When I said to somebody that I could always write more about Stevens, it produced a little set of 3 lectures that came out as a little book called Wallace Stevens, Words Chosen Out of Desire. And that turned out to be more popular, you might say, because people could read the short poems and read something about them, whereas to embark on Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction seemed a little much to ask of the layman interested in modern poetry. But after those long, opulent poems, Credences of Summer, Auroras of Autumn, Notes toward a Supreme Fiction. Beautiful poems. All of them sequences, all of them radially constructed, in which you have a center, like the Northern Lights, and then you have maybe 10 poems coming off the center. So it's not a chronological sequence, although Credences of Summer has elements of that. But still, they basically are concerned with a very rich metaphor like summer or the Northern Lights, and they explore avenues. It's as though it's like the where all those avenues that go off from the Arc de Triomphe. Sorry. Those are differently constructed from linear poems, and he got a lot said in those cantos, those long poems that have so much elbow room. I like them because they have elbow room. You sort of can move around within them. It's the beauty of a sequence that you can do that. But then towards the end of his life, he began to write some extraordinary short poems that came out, were supposed to come out in a separate volume called The Rock, but that never got published as a separate volume. It got folded into the collected poems of 1955, published on his 75th birthday, whereupon he died. That's why poets are afraid of doing collected poems. That seems a real tombstone to them. And in these late poems, the means become extraordinarily simple. The scenes become simple, unlike the scenes in the great autumn poems, the summer poems. The voice becomes simple, the diction becomes simple, the rhythms become simple. And I grew to love them before I understood why they were any good, because they seem to have that artlessness that's very hard to think about. It's very hard to think about a poem that begins the planet on the table, that begins, Ariel was glad he had written his poems. I mean, this is a sort of blank statement, and it doesn't so much invite the reader in as declare something to be imposed upon the reader, that Ariel was glad he had written his poems. So I didn't quite understand any of these moves, but gradually I got to understand them better. And I'm giving you two of the late poems. The first one, we'll hear in a minute, the final soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, is a revision, you might say, of To the One of Fictive Music. But what a difference. The One of Fictive Music was a queen. She was on a throne. She was addressed vertically, the way prayers and hymns are addressed to God. She had all those superlatives decorating her. And he was in the position of an acolyte or devotee. And the tones were all those tones of entreaty, incantation, praise. And suddenly she isn't a queen anymore, and she's not on a throne anymore. She's in fact in his room with him where he writes. And I saw his house once, which is now in the possession of the Anglican Deanery in Hartford, and they let us in to see it. And the bottom, it's a colonial house, quite ordinary looking, large, but on the bottom floor, as you face front, on the right-hand side, there's a sunroom. And then when you go upstairs to the bedrooms, Elsie had the main bedroom and the main bath sort of attached to it. And Stephen slept in one of the children's rooms, and Holly was sleeping in one of the other children's rooms. And then on top of the sun porch on the second floor was the room in which he used to write and listen to music, and go up there after dinner and put on a light and begin to perhaps take out things from his pocket that he had written down during the day, but compose. So that she's no longer on a throne, she's no longer full of superlatives. She is seen in erotic terms, not as sister and mother and diviner love, but just as love, a paramour. It's not a marriage. A paramour is not a wife. And this paramour is interior. The room they're in is really the room of his soul, heart, mind, whatever you want to, self. And she speaks. He writes a lyric for her to speak. She speaks to him. And the operative declaration about his own state, which she purveys to him, is, we are poor. And so it's written out of a condition of deprivation. and it's essentially a poem of consolation. What can the muse, the paramour, say to her, the fictive paramour really, say to her poet when he is without her, alone, cold? He needs something wrapped around him for warmth, which she offers him, and poor. And she addresses him, and it's a quiet address. It's not showy, like to the One of Fictive music. And it's phrased in the first person plural. There is no I here. There is no you here. There is only a we, so that the fusion of the interior paramour and the poet who is being addressed by his muse is complete. They are a we, they are never apart. They are always fused together. I think we could hear it.
Like the first light of evening, as in a room in which we rest, and for small reason think the world imagined is the ultimate good. This is therefore the intensest rendezvous. It is in that thought that we collect ourselves out of all the indifferences into one thing, within a single thing, a single shawl wrapped tightly round us, since we are poor, a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. Here now we forget each other and ourselves. We feel the obscurity of an order, a whole, a knowledge, that which arranged the rendezvous within its vital boundary in the mind. We say, God and the imagination are one. How high that highest candle lights the dark. Out of this same light, out of the central mind, we make a dwelling in the evening air, in which, being there together, is enough.
You can see that there are leftovers from To the One of Fictive music. This is then the intensest, another superlative, rendezvous. This actually is printed out from an erroneous copy text. There should be a comma after, should be a comma after rendezvous, that which arranged the rendezvous within its vital boundary. In the mind, there should be an in before the mind. When you try to see how she is consoling him, you can see that much of the consolation is, you might say, maternal. Somebody who takes you to her, wraps a single shawl around the two of you because we are poor, and brings with her a warmth and a light and a power, seems to be more mother, you might say, than beloved. And yet, the closer the poem gets to the end, the more she becomes the paramour rather than the mother, and the consolation she offers is being there together. And the two-ness of the poem is the great achievement for someone like Stevens, who wrote so many solitary poems and could not claim a two-ness that he didn't possess. He was in an unhappy marriage, and so when he invents people in his poems, they never have mates. There isn't any real paramour. There's never a real paramour. Lovely parables of the planter on an island of sky blue water. And the planter, although he has everything else, he has a garden, he has fruits, he has his house, he has his island, he has the sky. He cannot have a mate, because you can't write poems about your life and pretend that things are there that aren't. So that this imaginary, it's like something out of Spencer, she's like Florimel or something, the Interior Paramour. She's an allegorical figure, but she's given, you might say, royal status by the word paramour. We think of that with respect to the king's mistresses and so on. It's not a word you use every day. And it's a soliloquy, that is to say, she speaks it alone, but it's addressed to someone else. So it's a paradoxical soliloquy because it has an addressee, as soliloquies, the classic soliloquies, don't have. Hamlet is alone on the stage when he's doing his classic soliloquies. We make a dwelling. A dwelling is a very different place from the first line, a room. They're in a room. A room is a piece of architecture, but a dwelling is a created virtual home. And in this poem, he decides that the imagination, by which he means anything that is conceived out of fantasy, longing, expectation, effort, our being's heart and home, says Wordsworth, is with eternity and only there. With hope it is, hope that can never die, effort and expectation and desire, and something evermore about to be. And that's really what the imagination is always doing, something evermore about to be with effort and expectation and desire all wrapped into the ongoingness of the imagination. It has taken the imagination to make a dwelling out of that room. And since the imagination's function is to create, it is the nearest thing in the world of human beings that we know to the great fiat of the biblical creation by God. So when he says God and the imagination are one, he means that creating a world didn't die out when God disappeared. We create worlds every day, and they modify the way, the words of the poet are modified in the guts of the living, as Auden says about Yeats. They modify culture. What would culture be without Homer, without Dante, without Hamlet? Always the imagination is creating fictive worlds, and always culture is incorporating the fictive worlds and changing itself so that another great fiat has been made. This all happens in the mind. The room in which they sit is the mind. Within it, the intensest rendezvous takes place in the mind. When he hails, there's elements of the hymn here too, just as there was into the One of Fictive music. When he hails what the Interior Paramour could confer, what she confers is a warmth that's maternal, a light that's divine via looks, a power that is energy of some kind, and then finally the miraculous influence. This is to go outside the parameters of reality. Influence was thought to flow in from the stars. The whole of astrology is built on influence coming down from the stars, and it's a miraculous influence. It's as though something else is modifying your heart when you are in the realm of the imagination. Something seems to flood in from somewhere else. Many poets have testified to that feeling when Stevens does too in The Man with the Blue Guitar, when the thing takes off by itself and you no longer feel you are planning it or creating it in a detailed way, but that it has taken on its own momentum, the miraculous influence. We forget each other. In any human dyad, couple, you can't do that. Here now we forget each other and ourselves. It means that there's a total erasure of selfhood because of the warmth, the light, the power, the miraculous influence. You are literally transformed into another being so that you can forget the anxieties, troubles, occupations, or even the anxieties of the couple itself. It's a great line, we forget each other and ourselves. He has given us a nice version, nice metaphorical version of the imagination in making that list: a warmth, a light, a power, the miraculous influence. And then as always in Stevens, after he does it through the senses, warmth, light, he does it through the intellect. We feel the obscurity of an order. And then he does a list just of the same sort, only on a different plane. An order, a whole, a knowledge, warmth, light, power. But this time it's on the plane of the cognitive rather than the sensual. That which arranged the rendezvous. And that seems as miraculous to any poet as it does to any reader, that it actually happened. Emily Dickinson has a poem when the poet is exhausted by her effort of imagination, and she wants to finish up the poem. And a word comes up and says, I'm ready to fill that space. Shall I take thee, the poet said. And then the word is asking to be chosen, and the poet says, wait until I have finer tried. And she tries again and again, and she finally realizes that no word is ever going to come to her unless she fixes up her vision. And once she has understood the contour of her vision, then the word will come and fill in the blank. But while she's just looking for a word and not for an imaginative completion, the word will never come because she hasn't got the contour of the invisible missing part yet in her mind. So that order and whole and knowledge and rendezvous is not subject to the human will. It seems to be something that happens when you have finished your part in the action. The rendezvous happens. We say God and the imagination are one. And that simply means that we have not lost creation if we have lost God, because we are replicating the act of creation in the imagination every day. He didn't think the imagination was confined to poets either. And then there is the moment of the superlative. How high that highest candle lights the dark. But nonetheless, no matter how beautiful that image is of the highest candle, one of his early plays, Carlos Among the Candles, shows the candles gradually being extinguished. The dark is the word that ends the line, and the dark is very large, and it's always dark. And you light it by this or by that, by this, maybe by love in one case, maybe by nature in another case. But when you have this rendezvous, it is the highest candle, and it does send out its rays, but it can do only so much against the dark. It's not the northern lights. He speaks of the central mind, and it's what I think, for me, it's what enables that togetherness. The central mind is something you join when you join the mind as it has manifested itself over time, which we sometimes call tradition. There is a central mind, and as he says, every bird goes to that tree. When he gave a definition of tradition in a poem by that name, he goes through a series of negative definitions. It was a Phi Beta Kappa poem. Is it a law? No. Is it memory? No. So you have all the negative definitions, and finally you find out what is tradition. And it's Aeneas bearing Anchises on his back out of the fires of Troy. And so that the new poet bears the old tradition on his back out of the flames of the expiring culture and into the new culture out of Troy and into Rome, you could say. And that sense is done out of love, says Stevens, so that the sense that tradition is something you repair to, take something from, carry it safely out of Victorianism into modernity. It's not something that is a law that you have to obey or a form of literature that you have to imitate. It is something that you can't bear to let go. The poem operates on the word light, as you know, light, the first light of evening. There may be later ones, but this is the first one. A light, a power, the miraculous influence. How high that highest candle lights the dark. Out of this same light, out of the central mind. And then there's the wonderful feeling of at-homeness. We make a dwelling in the evening air, in which being there together is enough. Enough is for Stevens now the highest superlative in the language. Enough says, it's the old Latin satis that goes into the word satisfaction, when you are satisfied. And it is, even though it's a poem of a certain sort of poverty because we are poor, it is also a poem of a certain kind of blessedness. Being there together is enough. And that benediction at the end on is enough takes a common word and makes it stand for the highest good of the sense of connection between himself and whoever that inspiring creature is that rushes into his mind and makes a dwelling with him out of his home. It is, he says, enough. And the last one that I have here is a really beautiful poem that many of you already know. Not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. The Ding an sich, the thing in itself, is what is inaccessible. Supposedly you can never get through the phenomena to the noumenon. But he says, I can. And so it's a great, bold claim. Not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself.
Not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. At the earliest ending of winter, in March, a scrawny cry from outside seemed like a sound in his mind. He knew that he heard it, a bird's cry at daylight or before, in the early March wind. The sun was rising at 6, no longer a battered panache above snow. It would have been outside. It was not from the vast ventriloquism of sleep's faded papier-mache. The sun was coming from outside. That scrawny cry, it was a chorister whose sea preceded the choir. It was part of the colossal sun, surrounded by its choral rings still far away. It was like a new knowledge of reality.
In this poem, the very old man,
Sorry, I have no idea what that could be. A little Wallace Stevens mixtape.
for Stevens, I think for everyone old, the real question is, will you see another year? And winter has seemed to go on forever and ever and ever and ever. And he thinks he won't live this year to see spring. And he has just about given up. And it's still winter. But this is a poem about what he now perceives to be the earliest ending of winter, as though winter is going to end several times. It's going to have its earliest ending and the first announcement of spring, but then there's going to be another snowstorm, and then it will have an ending again, and finally it will have the last ending of winter when it goes away for good. But this is the moment that he loves on the cusp of a season where winter is turning into spring, and you can't believe you really are going to see another spring. And so when he wakes up and hears this bird cry outside, he thinks he imagined it. It was a dream. And then he tries to prove to himself that really was bird. And then he does it by analogy. When I look outside, it was dark outside a week or so ago, but now it's light. That means the sun is rising earlier. And that's a proof that spring is coming, that the sun is getting up at 6, no longer a battered panache above snow. And then he confirms the reality of the cry. It would have been outside. I didn't make it up. It was not a dream. It was not from the vast ventriloquism of sleep's faded papier-mache. Nobody has ever thrown away dreams so cavalierly in literature. Usually they're prized, but that's not real. It has no reality, dream, and I'm not going to depend on that. The sun was, as he says, coming from outside. And then that proves that the bird is coming from outside, too. It's kind of strange logic that inches along in the poem. That scrawny cry, he's alliterating in C, scrawny cry. And then the whole poem opens up. It's been scrawny up till then, and with rather diminished diction, although frequent repetitions of the same diction. But suddenly he sees that the little scrawny cry of the bird is the first sign of spring, and he's going to live through spring, and he was going to see the sun alive again, reigning in the heavens the way it should. And he begins to do an opulent diction to make up for the scrawny diction at the beginning when he wasn't sure he was ever going to see spring again at all. It was a chorister, the cry, chorister, choir, colossal, choral. That's the link of the opulence at the end of the poem. It's a pitch pipe. He was an altar boy in his youth, so he must, a choral, sang the altar boy's chorus, so that he would have heard the pitch pipe that gives the choir the note on which to start. And that's the C from the pitch pipe. And the C preceded, it's a pun, of course, the C precedes the choir. And the choir then comes in. And this little chorister is like, it's closest to Hardy's Darkling Thrush, and I wouldn't be surprised if he had the Darkling Thrush in mind, because the Darkling Thrush is singing a joyous song that Hardy himself can't feel at all. It's the end of the century. It was a chorister whose C preceded the choir. It was part of the colossal sun surrounded by its choral rings. And then you heard the way his voice fell, still far away. So he has the vision of summer, but he knows that that's still to come. But at least he has turned the corner. And what is he to end by saying? What he's so glad is that he didn't think it up. It was not from the vast ventriloquism of Sleep's faded papier-mache. It was not just a wish that had taken kind of dreamlike actuality in his mind. It was an actual, real bird's cry. And so he's not lying there having ideas about the thing, oh, it would be nice if spring would come, but he is suddenly visited by the thing itself, the first note of spring. And he could expand from that note into what is going to come, the great colossal sun and the full choir, and yet he knows it's still far away. What is it like? The first act of any poet is to say, what is this like? And make a metaphor or a simile, because it's only with resemblance that you can etch the outlines of what you're talking about. And he falls back on that ancient strategy of saying it was like, but it wasn't like anything. It was, the real is never like anything. The real is simply there. It is, you might say, an obstruction almost, because it will not yield to resemblance. It is so exact in itself. And so he says it was like a new knowledge of reality. Knowledge is the word that we saw in the final soliloquy of the Interior Paramour, too. It's after you go from the sense, the hearing, you then have to go up into knowledge. It has to, all poetry has to begin in the senses and continue in the mind. And it's just such a simple statement. It was like, and then a pause, it was like a new knowledge, secure word of reality, secure word. Nothing like ventriloquism and sleep and papier-mache, fake things. It's so plain, it's Quaker. You know, it's you couldn't get plainer than that. It was like a new knowledge of reality. So he leaves us with not ideas about the thing, but the thing itself. And when he is called a poet of the imagination rather than a poet of reality, this is the poem to think of, because he believes that the imagination is grounded in reality, and what you want to come to all the time is a new knowledge of reality upon which you can then construct a poem. Reality, he says in his adagia, is only the base, but it is the base, and so he won't let it go. Thank you.